Okay, so I'll do, if it's okay with you, like a little intro to what we're actually talking about, so anyone listening in or watching can kind of get a sense of what we're trying to do today. And basically, we're talking about this book here, which is, so excuse my pen, is Metamodernism, The Future of Theory by Jason Ananda and Josephson Storm. I don't know if I've pronounced those correctly. I discovered this via text on the internet, so it being I haven't heard the names. I've only read the opening, and I was hoping that today we would cover that, with some efforts to try and like solidify the integration of the material or explanation of the material by trying to roll a little bit of something a bit arty. I mean, that's probably the most kind of that's the best way I can describe of explaining it. So I've got some pictures and things, and we were just before this, we were talking, Jermaine, and you were saying, or I suggested, and I think you agreed. I just want to check on that before we carry on, that you'd maybe have a go at producing something artistic or doing something during the session, try and fold a bit of that about the creative thinking in. Is that right?
I'm gonna give it a go.
Brilliant, brilliant. And the other thing you mentioned as well before this was that you've actually read the whole book in advance of this session.
Accidentally.
Yeah, yeah, because we were just going to do one, but it would be great to hear you talk through your impressions of the whole thing, because obviously I haven't read it all. I'm going to try and stick diligently to one chapter at a time, but having an overview might be quite nice as well for people to hear. So yeah, what do you think?
um, I'll start with one of the criticisms I've heard about the book. One of the criticisms I've heard about the book, it doesn't engage with uh, meta modern theory papers, uh, for etc. Which I do accept. And at the same time, I don't think I've actually read a meta modern book that does that well. Um, the ones I have been far more academic. This is quite an academic book, so there's that. Um, I think it's pretty essential reading for anyone who wants to be involved in metamodernism, especially anyone who's coming up with any kind of theory, a theory of anything, a theory of how to solve the meta crisis, a theory of how to get through the culture war. I think it's essential reading if you want to be doing metamodernism.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and it makes us think. And at one point, he says this book is like meta-modern therapy, and I agree with him. I think meta-modern is a form of archaeology and a form of therapy, and reading this book will help us uh, find some internal solutions to the past crisis of the oscillation between modernism, meta-modernism, and postmodernism that we find ourselves in. So yeah.
Archaeology. Yeah, like a kind of internal archaeology.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
going
love
through our
that
histories,
metaphor.
going through the way that we perceive the world, or we have perceived the world, or and yeah, and realigning our history, our personal history, with the information we have now, so that we can try and make it to the future and a future for our children and grandchildren and
Yeah,
descendants.
yeah. Yeah, so something about being embedded in a lineage or a
Mm.
motion through is part of the theme. Okay, that's good. Um, Now all I've read is the opening, um,
Mhm.
and I don't know how much of it you can remember, given that you've read the whole thing. But the impression I got was that the scene was kind of being set, really. The question of like, why might we need metamodernism? Why does it matter? Like, it felt like that the opening was kind of somehow uh, kind of explicating that. So trying to make that kind of clear. Um, as I was reading it, and I keep looking over to my other screen over here. I was making notes, and what I was hoping was if maybe I could share those, and we could have a chat about, I could maybe explain or discuss what was perhaps going on for me. You could respond. Equally, if at any point you feel like one of the things you're working on now is done somehow, and you want to share it, then just at any time, just let me know. Because there's something about the integration of material, and I'm saying this as a kind of, I suppose, a teacher as well as someone who's just into creativity in general. But there's sometimes trying to step outside of this kind of like quite logical isness, isn't-ness, quite like argumentative, good, bad, right, wrong way of thinking. Whilst we need some of that, it can be a little bit it's only one way of kind of interpreting a piece of text, and so art is a way of kind of sidestepping or sidestepping some of the problems that come from that form of thinking, but also just a different way of engaging with something. So if I go ahead and share my screen, and let's try this one. See, when I was making the notes, I made them in a certain order, but it'd be interesting to see if they come, if as I find the pictures, they come in a different order. Let's see. Okay, are you seeing that there? Yeah. So
I was going to ask, is this talking about the way that everything seemed very concrete, like let's say pre-modern times, and to modern times everything seemed kind of concrete, and then the meanings of things have kind of been dissolving into nothing over the course of postmodernism, also with the realization of the uncertainty principle and all of that.
Yeah. It's
that's kind of what I'm getting from the thing breakdown, and I'm really interested in what you in your take on this, how the next image of Move Nowhere.
It's again, it's one of some of the problems I think outlined by or that emerge as a result of postmodernism, which is that you can kind of critique at something into nothing, and then you can kind of critique the critique. And one of the problems that comes about by just constantly critiquing everything is that things begin to dissolve, right? So, and there's this sense of not being able to stand solidly on anything, right? So there's like a kind of a sort of mush, and then what comes along with that is probably the same or something in the direction of if you were to stand on, say, some quicksand or on something that wasn't quite solid, there's a level of anxiety that's going to emerge when you're doing that, and there's something of that emotional tone can come about when all we ever do is this postmodern critique over and over and over again. And so, and there's also some discussion in the book about the academy, and how there are silos in the academy. You've got different disciplines, each often using different language to describe the same thing, but viewing it in slightly different ways, not properly talking to each other. So, and because of that lack of clearly defined boundaries around things, nothing ends up feeling totally solid. So there's like a slipperiness to reality or something, you know. Um, and yeah, that negate everything, move nowhere thing. I think what was coming up for me was this sense of almost analysis paralysis that can
mm,
come when you just everything has a problem with it. So you don't move anything, you don't move anywhere, and you don't do anything because there's always a flaw or a problem or an issue with a particular thing.
mm,
Um, some of those words down there um, at the bottom of the page,
mhm.
I don't know if that means anything. I don't know if you get anything from that. Be interesting to hear what you think on that before I say.
What I'm getting is that we've reached the limits of conceptual analysis, as Jason Storm says. Postmodernism kind of it's good. It was good for something, but now it's kind of meeting diminishing returns.
Mm,
Um, and I can see the words at the top. I can definitely see creation, and then something's written over it. And at the bottom, I think I can see words which could be, but maybe aren't, power, knowledge, and ignorance. I'm not
hmm
sure. And to me, that kind of speaks to how our creative side has been kind of conceptual analysis is kind of constricting our creative side. And it, our ways of approaching power and knowledge have, as a result of that limitation, become filled with ignorance, which is completely the opposite. Um, yeah, I don't know. That's kind of what
Yeah,
I'm getting.
yeah, yeah. So it's weird is I can't actually remember all of the words. I think that the main thing that was coming was that there's a like a a smushing up of these different things, right? So
Mm,
knowledge, it kind of becomes power
mm,
or a form of power, right?
mm,
And so when we start thinking of knowledge as power,
mm,
it stops being about knowledge anymore and starts
mm,
being about power acquisition. And then there's a kind of a bleeding effect when we view it that way. There's it becomes something to be fought over
mm,
rather than some kind of shared thing that we're all kind of engaged with.
mm,
Um, and there's also this like smushing of the boundaries between things, and because of that smushiness, it's like it starts to become unintelligible, which it literally is for me. I can't even read what I've put for that. So maybe I can, if I read it in the book. Let me see if I can. Yeah, knowledge, power. Yeah, no, I can't read what those words are.
Oh yeah, I can see that it
What's
doesn't
the
have
point?
ignorance at the bottom. It's just the K. I felt the K. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it kind of makes sense anyway.
yeah, yeah.
um,
So, what do you think about all of that? Like, do you buy it? Just like, is it as simple as postmodernism doesn't work, we should ditch it, or like, what do you think?
so something that Jason Storm says quite often is that postmodern just simply doesn't go far enough.
Mm,
So I'm gonna go back to the thing, the dissolving thing.
yeah.
Um, as you rightly said, okay. So actually, I'm gonna go back a little bit. So as you right, Jill Nephews has come up with. She's on Facebook as well,
Mm,
in a kind of quite a few circles. She's in the Black Metamodernism group. She's come
yeah.
up with this thing called analytical intelligence versus natural intelligence. Basically, what we've been using for a long time to make our way through the world is this analytical intelligence. Kierkegaard wrote a book about it called Either Or, and
Mm,
it's basically applying dichotomous thought to break down the world to make sure it makes sense of what it is. The thing is, we haven't gone far enough with this, and now we've got to breaking everything down to nothing, and we decided to stop. So we're not critiquing what nothing is or isn't. We thought, okay, it's nothing.
ah,
That's it. Done and
yeah,
dusted. So,
yeah.
for instance, nihilism. does this as well. Breaks it all the way down to nothing, but doesn't say what nothing is. Skeptical thought does this. I'm going to be skeptical of everyone and everyone else, but I'm not going to be skeptical of my own skepticism. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when we have problems of lacking of intellectual humility, for instance.
Yeah.
So basically, what he's saying is that postmodernism just hasn't gone far enough. You need to apply it further, and once we apply it further, then we can round everything out. For instance, in nihilism, once you reduce everything and say everything has no value or nothing has value, it's like, okay, fair enough. But if you go further, you'll see that actually the concept of nothing itself and what it points to, which is not nothing, both have value. And so in that sense, you find again the value in everything, you know? It's a very, very quick and easy trick to do. Uh, but yeah, we haven't been doing that. And that's basically seems to be what he's saying. I don't know if I'm spoilers. I'm trying not to give spoilers because
Yeah.
the technical ways he said to do this are very, but I feel like he said bits of that in the first chapter. I hope he did.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, I think that the value of, I mean, that's great. Like, I just, as you were talking about that, I could just feel like the grin just like moving across my face, because it's just that yeah. One point that is made is that it's metamodernism, at least as it's framed in this book, is it's almost like taking postmodernism and doing more of it. So it's like a deepening of postmodernism rather than a retraction or an avoidance or a running away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was captured in some of these other images as well. So maybe we could look at those. Right, let me just share.
So while you're doing that, I found it amazing. Yesterday, I was Brett Brent has traced a lot of the literature, and so I was looking through his list, and one of them it said that emotional intelligence was a metamodern sensibility. Yeah, which for some reason I've never thought of, but it makes sense. You're taking two different opposing ideas, intelligence, emotionality,
Huh.
and you're slamming them together.
Yeah.
And I feel like once you add that, then that leads to, yeah,
Yeah.
that leads to the solution to this analytical dichotomous,
Yeah.
because emotions are much more, ambivalent.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to be here talking to you. At the same time, I've got a pain in my arm, which makes me want to lie down. But I also know that lying down is not going to help the pain in my arm, and I need to move. And so it's
Mm.
just these mixtures of feelings that we have to carry. I feel like that's what metamodernism is asking us to do. So I
Yeah.
find that interesting.
Yeah. 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 And there's something about emotional intelligence too, which is kind of simultaneously about coming to terms with one's own emotions, but also coming to acknowledge other people's.
Yeah.
And there's something about acceptance, but also management,
Mm-hmm.
which is another potential dichotomy. It could, that you could frame that as a kind of a binary, like
Yeah.
either you're allowed to have the emotions, or you're allowed to manage them, but you can't do both.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to do that wouldn't be particularly emotionally intelligent. So yeah,
No.
that's a really good point.
Or healthy. That's a very good point you just made.
Right.
Wouldn't be healthy to it's always healthier to accept my emotions and then manage them after. As a performer, if I
Mm.
get anxious of going on stage, I have to accept that emotion and then manage it by realizing that it's actually my excitement driving me to do what I need to do. But if I just did one or the other, if I just tried to manage it, said, "Oh, it's my excitement," I'll just be too on stage. If I didn't accept it, if I just tried to, yeah, and if I just accept it, then I'm just gonna be too nervous and I'm not gonna
Yeah,
do anything. So, yeah.
that's it. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So this was the thing um that I got. So
Mm,
which is linking to, I think, what you were what we were just talking about,
mm,
which is, so I drew a little picture there, and I don't know what that thing is in the middle, but I know the outside thing is sort of a badly drawn and colored in square.
mm.
but there's this question of what the thing is.
Hmm.
Like, is it the bit that's colored in black surrounding the object, or is it the object itself, or like even the fact that I'm describing the object as if I'm assuming that you know what it is perhaps a problem, because the bit that I colored in, the bit that I where the place that I took pen to paper and where I actually took some kind of action is the not the thing in the middle, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So, and there's for me there was invocations of kind of like the shadow, and the kind of stuff that we've chatted about, and discussed on the Black Metamodernism page, and elsewhere as well around this where does the thing actually reside,
Hmm.
right? And that feels kind of like quite a postmodern thing to be saying. Um, I'm also aware that there's less than 1 minute on the
Oh,
call,
really?
so I'll what I'll need to do is I'll throw another link in. Okay. Um, does that work for you?
Yeah, sure. I would just like to say that I feel like what makes the thing and what makes the not thing here is the interaction in between the two. And
Yeah.
that is also one of the main key points I've taken from this book. It's that
Yeah.
interaction
Could
processes.
could you repeat that point when we come? Could you? Would that be okay? Just because I'll probably snip that end bit off and stitch it. Okay, brilliant. Um, okay. See you on the other side. See you soon.
Cool.
Great. Okay. So, um, we were here
Yes.
before Zoom booted us because I'm a skinflint and haven't paid for the upgrade. But I was just saying to you before that I quite like those little breaks that they insist on you taking. Um, so yeah, you were just before then you were talking about. Can you remember what it was? I don't want to say it for
Yes.
you.
We were to answer the question of what makes a thing and what makes a non-thing. I was going to say the interaction between the two.
Mm.
Um, I'm trying not to give a spoiler, but that is a big uh, yeah, it's a big, for the first chapter, that is kind of a big clue as to how he solves the anti-realism realism debate.
Ah,
Um,
right.
yeah,
Okay. Okay, cool. So I've got there's a bit of a premonition on my part then for kind of what's to come
yeah,
in terms of that. Interesting, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
I do like what you've written below because it does it it uh it speaks directly to kind of what's happening in metamodernism at the moment.
mm,
Uh, but in that I'm guessing this is postmodernism equals not postmodernism is you saying about when Jason talks about how actually a lot of the anti-modern and postmodern thesis are actually found from modern writers or what and in modern terms, and so actually the this separation between postmodernism and modernism uh, is kind of a lot more fluid than people think, and actually a lot of postmodern writers actually disagree with some things and actually agree with modern writers. A lot of modern writers actually are the ones who came up with the postmodern ideas in the first place. And yeah,
yeah,
a lot of it's constructed. Like post-structuralism is completely constructed by American lenses on continental European uh, philosophies.
right.
Yes, I just found that very interesting. Maybe I've
Yeah,
jumped a bit ahead again, but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. But that thing about things kind of things emerging out of the not things, or the not things being the things that are the actual things, is kind of mirrored there a bit, isn't it? Like the
yeah,
um and postmodernism actually not being a distinct, or being as distinct and as separate from modernism as people often talk about it, you know, being. Um, and I think the other thing there as well is that if we're going to define postmodernism as being about critique, that critique that's missing, that you were talking about earlier, about critiquing the critique, or um, or coming to terms with the nothing that emerges when everything is critiqued into nothing. That's yeah, it's almost as if postmodernism didn't do itself well enough,
Mm-hmm.
in some way. So it isn't actually the thing that we talk about it being.
Like I think Jason Storm says negate the negations, which I love that.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
He
yeah.
says that in this chapter, so I don't think I'm jumping ahead.
It's fine anyway. Yeah, it's okay for us to reach ahead a little bit. Um, yeah. Um, so that postmodernism and other essays, I think I just made a note of that because they mentioned that that's one of the first times I think postmodernism is is mentioned
Mm,
in the title of something
mm.
back in 1926. I mean, yeah. So that's kind of when it first gets its name, apparently. I thought that was quite an important thing to make a note of. Um, so yeah, so there's that. Is that is anything going on for you in terms of your art or creativity yet? Is that
I've done a little bit.
cool?
I'm not really. I'm more of a words person,
Yeah,
um,
okay.
and I'm not sure how much this is to do with the first chapter or just what's going through my head. I'm just making
Hmm.
some
Well,
other notes.
I'll stop sharing mine now. And
Okay, all I've got so far is this, um,
haha, yeah,
and it's just to show the difference between oscillation and moving beyond, I guess.
right.
um,
Yeah,
and I guess
like a kind
especially
of
if we have a conflation of modernism and postmodernism, then you know by saying that we're oscillating between the two, are we really? By saying that we're exploring the space in between, um, can we do that without oscillating? And yeah, this is basically how I think it needs a lateral movement um,
hmm.
along, if you're a mathematician, along the imaginary axis,
Yeah.
um, as opposed to along the real number line. Um, Yeah, and that all the I think the Gauss called it lateral as well. He called them direct and indirect numbers instead of positive and negative, and lateral numbers instead of imaginary numbers, because imaginary numbers and real numbers are kind of misleading, poor, unimaginative names. Um, yeah, I'm
Huh.
I'm trying not to skip ahead again,
All
but
right. Okay. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So I've got that. Then I'm just something I'm thinking about what hypermodernity is, because I do believe we're in hypermodern times now. I do think that hypermodernity is a product of oscillating between modernity and the modernity without going far enough beyond into the
Ah,
meta.
right.
Um, but then I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, and maybe there's another circle that encompasses all of this, which is meta modern. I'm not sure
Hmm.
because I don't really think hypermodernity is a form of both anding modernism and postmodernism,
Yeah.
but not a very thorough. The degrees of dichotomy are still in there, basically. And
Yeah.
on that, I just kind of grouped at the bottom dichotomous. I think that says
Yeah.
analytical. Dichotomous and analytical thought kind of go hand in hand, whereas this diunital, emotional, and a natural intelligence kind of they also go hand in hand. As I
Yeah.
said, sorry, this is more thoughts of
Yeah. It's
yeah.
been nice following your kind of through line on this stuff. You're obviously spending a lot of time on focusing on this particular area of and I read an article of yours recently. So and anywhere that stuff like plugs into the book and what's covered in the book, I think would be great to hear. And for anyone else that's listening and kind of wants to get involved in this, like um in my opinion, that the point where the book is useful is where it intersects with any one of like our given lived realities, and all of us are going to have a little corner of the metamodern space, or a little area that in any given moment is really lighting up for us. And so seeing how that intersects with the book is, I think, as important
Yeah.
as giving a nice, clear, well-defined rationale of what the book is doing. It's like, if you want to do that, like, read the book, you know,
Yeah.
like, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's the beauty about making a book that helps you with the practice of theory.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it can then its applications then can be very wide in whatever. So three
Yeah.
different people can read it and come up with three different um, ideas or ways to move ahead with this. And actually, he calls for a lot of work in the book. He calls for us to do a lot of work in terms of breaking down these, these arbitrary categories that have been put up, or looking at the categories of redefining things, redefining what our values are, redefining everything, so that we can finally start moving again with knowledge and not just with trying to grope for that broken down thing that you had earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. It feels like kind of what's coming up for me as an image when you're talking like that is like a kind of kneading of dough or something.
Mm,
Like it's a kind of, unless you put that work in, then it's not going to rise somehow.
yeah.
Um, you know. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, yeah, cool. Okay, well, that's good. That's a bit of something. Keep on with that. You
Yeah.
know, if it comes to you and you want it. Um, right. Let me share my next screen if that's okay with you.
Mhm.
Um, so I think we've done that one. We've done that one. Um, let's see. Right.
Yeah.
So here we go. Next one. So yeah, there was some discussion in the book about hyper specialization
Mm,
and obscurism,
mm,
and as I was interacting with it, the text, there was a sense of a kind of chasm almost opening up
mm,
between the two of them. Um, and in that chasm is where we could do to try and situate ourselves, was the impression that I was getting.
mm.
Um, so yeah,
Can
that
you remind me of what obscurism is again, please?
so no, no, but obscurism. I'm going to just riff and
Yes.
hope that my unconscious provides the necessary stuff. Um, so I think this is about almost trying to build in language which is unique to a given specialty, right?
Mm,
So there's a kind of almost purposefully pulling over of pulling putting obstacles in the way of people understanding things,
mm,
to and it's back to this knowledge as power thing,
mm,
right? And it can happen often in the academy, um but it, as well as it being perhaps a kind of, you could say that there's something almost malignant or uh, kind of a bit nasty about people doing that kind of thing, but it can also, I think, happen totally by accident,
mm,
which is, if you're a hyper specialist, right? And there's lots of this in the academy. There's just lots of this in reality, right? There's often a focus on becoming a specialist in a given field or other, um, and not reaching beyond the boundaries or the edges of whatever that given field is. And so then you get a kind of echo chamber, and then the
mm,
language that emerges in that echo chamber becomes kind of unobtainable to
mhm,
people outside of the echo chamber.
mhm,
So I think part of it emerges naturally, just as anytime somebody decides oh, I want to really, really get into a given niche of a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche, right? Anytime somebody goes on that path, um, the number of people that they can interact with about that thing is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the language that's going to emerge in those small groups is going to, by necessity, be quite obscure, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and and a thing, and this is what the fractal is, right? There's something about living in the chasm and holding both to be true, and the answer to that seemed to be like in terms of a symbol for that might be a fractal, which is like if you can specialize, and it must be possible to specialize in such a way that you can still speak to the whole somehow. So obviously the thing about a fractal is that a tiny element can recursively grow to continue to almost be the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So I think this was my drawing of an attempt to try and um kind of explain that. And all those arrows, I think that is kind of the kneading of the dough that I was just talking about, you know. I think that's what's going on there, is this kind of this sense of recursion as a potential solution to some of the problems that come from this hyper specialization and obscurism thing. Now, do you know what? It's coming back to me a little more now,
Mm-hmm.
what obscurism means, right? And I think it's to do with the unknown,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is that reality we don't know what things are,
Mm-hmm.
and so we try by hyper specializing often
Mm-hmm.
to pin down the boundaries or the edges of a given thing, or all the factors that contribute to a given thing. And the problem with that is that the more detailed that we go, the less of the whole that we see,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
um and that's a kind of danger, I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
which is that in the very act of trying to map reality and interact with and see everything as it is, we end up only looking at a tiny portion of it.
Mm-hmm.
um and so yeah, so I think one of the things is that we need kind of both. I think that was the impression that I was getting, and maybe I imposed it on the book, but the impression I was getting was that the way forward is some kind of doing both, right? Now I'm thinking about that as perhaps a form of oscillation,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like looking really closely at a given bit of reality and then stepping out and looking at the whole and then looking very closely. But I don't think that oscillation, like you're saying, is enough. It's almost like, yes, we can do that, and that perhaps ought to be part of what we do, but there's also something about simultaneously, which is where the fractal comes in, holding the minute detail and the bigger picture
Mm-hmm.
together.
Mm-hmm.
um I don't know how any of that lands with you.
Yeah, I agree. Um, yeah, yeah. Management of the unknown, I think, is one of the biggest motivations for the human unconscious, I'll say.
Mm,
Um, because the human unconscious is largely unknown to us.
yeah,
And so in order, it kind of needs to manage itself for us because we're not able to do it. But that whole process is scary because there's this whole thing unseen, unfelt, unsensed that's churning away inside of us that we have no idea what it's doing.
yeah,
And often we try to negate that and focus on the conscious mind, you know?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and we kind of hyper specialize on the conscious mind because it gives us visible products of the invisible. So we focus on that, try and separate it out
Yeah.
in order to work out what is going on underneath. But in doing so, we ignore what's going on underneath. And that's kind of the same thing we're doing with the hyper specialization. For example, we'll take science here and we'll take spirituality here.
Yeah.
And we want to understand where really what we're trying to do is understand the source of both of those things, you know? Where does what is a product, what is a source of the physical laws in the universe, and what are they? And also, what is the source of human perseverance through the human condition,
Hmm.
and what are the best ways to do that? And in somewhere intuitively, for me anyway, and I think this is true for a lot of people, those things are linked. But because we can't approach them, because there's such different things, we can't approach them. So we separate them and we say, okay, I'm going to specialize on this, I'm going to specialize on that, and then we get I don't know 58 types of religious mystical experience on one hand, and
Yeah.
we get the whole laws of physics on the other hand, and then and it's great. We've come up with a lot, but actually we haven't really come up with what we were trying to find out in the first place. Is actually where do those things both originate from, where do they both come from, and so the thing that we're actually going for, we were actually looking for in the first place, becomes obscured, as you're saying, due to the hyper specialization, and actually because there's these silos, as Jason talks about, then they're not. There's no real communication between them. Everyone's working separately, individualism and all of that, and so there's this massive chasm in between where you know there's actually a lot that could be and to be fair, this started to happen for instance, once science started to look at Buddhism, meditation, and yoga in earnest,
Hmm.
that's when we started to make some real advances, in terms of, okay, well, this is what consciousness isn't, at least. Um, yeah. And this is what the human brain is capable of, and it starts to lead us to some answers which quite often neither side really like, Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. What's interesting is that obviously, like in Europe, like there was the kind of whole alchemical thing, right, that was going on.
Hmm.
Um, and chemistry is, as a name, is derived from
Hmm.
alchemy.
Hmm.
And so there's in medieval Europe, there wasn't so much of this fragmentation. There was a sense of it all being part of the same kind of thing. Um, and so it's interesting that Europeans have become so kind of divorced from that history that we've needed to look outside of Europe for somehow trying to get back at grasping that. And I think the challenge is how how can we how can we do that without forgetting all the lessons of like bifurcation and separation and you know because there's something about the modern view, which is that you can take the world and you can put it into chunks and then you can assess which things are good and which things are bad, and you can make progress on the basis of that information. How do we keep that whilst also allowing for this crossing over
Hmm.
that you're talking about? um and there's something about the meta and the post which is really trying to make sure that we don't just go back to you know medieval forms of alchemy as um it's almost like maybe we could have that alongside that
Hmm.
alongside you know all the other things that kind of
Hmm.
that kind of come in, you know. Um, and that's another interesting, like, also the other thing to consider in all of that is like the damage that's done by these cuts in reality,
Mhm.
you know. Um, when science isn't divine anymore, like,
Mhm.
what does that mean, you know? And I think we've kind of, you know, many of us have been sort of living through the results of that, right? Like that, the damage of that splitting. But it'd be nice to have our cake and eat it, I think.
Mm.
And you know, it'd be nice to be able to maintain the good stuff that we got from, you know, the hyper specialization. Um, whilst also whilst also somehow feeling whole rather than constantly segregated.
I think it is possible to have a cake and eat it.
Yeah.
Always,
Yeah.
always. I think it's just
Always.
a matter of perspective.
Yeah.
So if I'm happy with the fact that I can have my cake and eat it, and
Mm.
I will have it still, but just not in front of me. You know, it will be inside me. It will be producing nutrients and energy. Um, yeah. So it won't be in the same form that it was in. Or I can
Mm.
eat it in a different way. I could eat it with my eyes, for instance, and not actually eat it with my mouth. You know,
Mm.
or I can eat it with concepts and say, okay, I'm gonna have a little bit and work out what this is, and then I make another and work out what the ingredients, and I'm gonna make another cake, and then I can eat my cake and then have another cake in the future, you know. So
Yeah.
I think it's all about, and this is kind of what metamodernity is about, where this is where modernism said, oh, there's one objective perspective, which is kind of has to be sat outside of the existence to get that objective perspective.
Mm.
Um, but science and modernism said, oh, there was this objective perspective. And then postmodernism says, oh, well, there isn't this objective perspective. There's just loads of different subjective perspectives. And, they're unlikely to ever really agree. And when you boil them down, there's nothing there, you know?
Mm.
And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
thanks for that. But what are we going to do with that,
Yeah.
And now we've got the both and for me would be, and this kind of points to where we can go with hyper specialization in the future is the both and is okay. Well, there is no objective. However, there are all of these subjectives which, when together, make an intersubjective, and that's the closest we're going to get to objective.
Yeah.
And something that I think needs to happen with metamodernism, uh, there are hypermodern and modern theories of everything coming about, and I can see that all of the different ones have slightly different angle and slightly different. All the different writers have slightly different strengths.
Mm.
Um, they're all missing bits, including me. We're all
Right.
missing bits. And if
Yeah.
we were actually to come together and work in a way where we could share and not be worried about credit and all of this, then we could
Yeah.
actually build something that is, yeah. I can think of uh, four models, five models if they got put together. That is Troy Camplin's Diaphysics, uh, Bobby Askren's Romance from Reality, Brendan's Emergentism, which I could go on to, but I'm not. And then Jill Nephew's Natural Intelligence. If you take those and you add it with the theory with my model of eminence, which no one understands, which is fine, uh, we could make something which it would be pretty indestructible. But the problem is at the moment is that we're not able to do that. Um, yeah, and so now there are silos of different groups, and
Hyper specialization again, huh?
yeah, that's the way it goes. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, academia, the academy, as Jason calls it,
Mm.
uh, has a lot to answer for. Needs to take a really hard look at itself and inject some intellectual humility and emotional intelligence back into it, because it's yeah, it's very hard for anyone. People like Jill Nephew is a brilliant creative.
Mm.
Um, brilliant. What she's come up with is brilliant, and the amount of difficulty that she's had in getting the message across, like the amount of difficulty I've had in getting my message across, is to the academia, because it is basically an old boys club. It's just, yeah, and that's one of the problems. But at the same time, see you. One of the solutions is, well, one of the hopeful things is the fact that, actually the future is not set up for postmodern and modern thinking. It's not set up for those. It's too complex for that. It's too complex for the analytical mind. And so in the future, those who are emotionally intelligent, those who are able to build a natural intelligence, they they will, yeah, they'll get ahead a lot better in the future, I think. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's yeah. I mean, stuff like AI is having its say, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and this thing of this intersubjective thing, I think is part of the answer. Um, it's yeah, it's kind of a remembering of the fact that we co-create
Hmm.
everything,
Yeah.
even if we think that we've got the thing,
Hmm.
you know, um, like we don't as individuals.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's yeah, I think that's a problem for the wider like scene, if you will, whether it's whether you want to call it the liminal web or you know, I thought it was game B for a while, but it's bigger and wider than that, and some people, there's the metamodern scene and there's all these kind of intersecting um views,
Hmm.
and I think there's just to get back to the game B thing is that there's something in that which is the way that we relate to each other, i.e. like this is mine and I need to defend it,
Hmm.
and not only because I'm proud of my ideas and you know and perhaps I'm feeling a bit insecure about my ideas, but there's this other layer as well of like, well, who's got a book or a course or a there's
Here we
there's
go.
right there's this kind of like uh and it's very difficult to know what to do in a to use the language from game A, game B, to use the language from that scene in a game A world, transitioning into one of mutual creation when everything feels like it's kind of pulling you into a silo all the time.
Hmm.
um that's in a way, maybe that's the challenge. Like you say, it's not that the ideas aren't there.
Hmm.
It's not that people are doing like amazing shit all over the place. It's how do we, yeah, you're right, like how do we interlock and dance together, or see it as a thing. So
It's
that's a challenge for us all, I think, you know to
it's
try and
interesting you bring up Game B, because Game B and Integral have both stagnated, completely stagnated. There's not really much output of what they're doing in order to achieve their goal. Um, Modernism is on its way to do the same thing.
it's
It's very
interesting
close. And
noticing
if you
that
look at it,
noticing that pattern though, right? Like it's almost
yeah,
that's an emergent function of whatever the hell it is we're doing. That you get a little thing, it has a peak, then then it sort of dries out for some reason, and then there's a descent.
I can
um
identify two reasons. One is that we're using the same thinking that created the crisis, this analytic dichotomous thinking, solely as a
yeah,
dominant thinking, and the other one is uh, the monetization of it. And if it's not direct monetization in terms of getting money, it's social power and popularity
Yeah.
which is driving things. Game B, 100%. Integral, Wilbur took up from Gebza in a massive way and
Mm.
monetized what Gebza did massively. Um,
Yeah.
Modernism is now the same. Where we're getting into the point where instead of, I mean, there are groups which are called metamodernism, which it'd be questionable where to what extent the leadership are writing metamodernism books, for example, or running metamodernism workshops, you know, which they're charging for, or running classes to
Mm.
teach about metamodern uh, and metamodern practice, which is questionable. To what extent is it metamodernism? Why is it metamodern? And in all of these groups, the very definition of metamodernism isn't really solid. Similar with Game B, similar
Mm.
with Integral. It's not really solid. What is it? In a couple of sentences, what is it? And they're not able to do that. And yeah, there's
Yeah.
this quote. There's this quote here. That just one quick quote from zero point 0.1, and it says, "But, and this is also a key point. Metamodernism does not stand on my characterization of past movements. It is not an argument rooted in the authority of political philosophical progenitors, nor is it an attempt to describe an already inchoate moment. It is rather an exercise of the first order theorizing. If successful, the result should be self-sufficient, and so his descriptions of postmodernism should function only as a catalyst." And really, that's, you know, that's what we're looking to do, is we're looking to push through and make a theory which actually is self-evident and self-sufficient in what it is. And if it's not that, then it is kind of, we need to look at what we're not doing right, basically.
Mm. So you're feeling like there needs to be a kind of a more of a solidity to things, like in
Yeah.
terms of as knowing what it is that we're talking about.
Otherwise, we
Um,
repeat the meaning crisis, you know?
yeah, I see. I mean, maybe this is just a personal preference thing, but I I kind of I quite like the obscurity. That's an interesting choice of words given what we've just been talking about. But it's actually probably the right one, right? Which is I quite like that there's something exciting about it not knowing what it is yet. Um, and it's interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking about the analogs to musical movements or, you know, underground movements and then them somehow breaking out into the mainstream, and then this notion of selling out um and I think one of the things that perhaps might need to be embedded in the solidity that you're after would need to be a sense of a capacity for recursion, or again it's coming to know that we don't know. It's almost like that we need to find a solidity on the non-solidity.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's perhaps part of our way of interacting with the metamodern scene, you know, whatever language you want to use to describe whatever it is that we're doing, is that we can't always know where it's going to go. And there's a certain part of me anyway that takes a kind of delight in that, kind of like enjoys, you know, there's something emergent,
Mm-hmm.
you know, going on, and that's part of the fun, you know, like watching a piece of art come together, you know. That one of the things I made a note on was a quote. We're about to run out of Zoom time again, but I was hoping if it would be okay with you if we could come back and we could run with one of the quotes that I took from the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of the book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. So we did two previous short discussions, and we were going to do another one. Ended up getting sidetracked, and so not recording the like the final bit of this. It's been quite a. I think it's not quite a month. Been about maybe 3 weeks or something. I think
Yeah, it's the new year now.
since that we're now in the new year. So my beard is a bit longer. Jermaine said just before recording that his is a bit shorter. Also, my hair is a bit longer, and I've changed my clothes. So that's why all of these things have happened, just because we've taken a little break. So I wanted to kind of try and jump straight in on this because we ended the last one with a. I wanted to show a quote, and the other thing as well was that you were talking about emergence, and I think we could probably do to maybe dig into that a little bit as well. But if it's okay with you, if we could start with this,
Yeah.
And I'm going to try and share screen. There we go. Okay. So hopefully you're seeing that now. And it's an image of just for those who are only listening, it's an image of a quote, and it says, "What one might call territorial pissing is widespread, as academic departments are often pitted against each other for increasingly scarce funding." That's on page 19. And I've put then after that academic departments in quote marks, and then corners of the liminal web in brackets question mark. So this, and the reason why I wanted to kind of raise this is this problem in the academy, right, which is different academic departments speaking their own languages about things and kind of getting siloed, and also perhaps competing for resources, for money. I wanted to just point out that there's a flavor of that right across what I would call probably the liminal web.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'll stop sharing this now. Hopefully you've got the gist of the quote and my thoughts on it. But like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really keen observation made by Storm, and I'm glad you brought it out because it shows the opportunity of where modernism can come in terms of the both and dialectical thinking in order to start uniting some of these different disciplines.
Mm.
But at the same time, it speaks to a worldview based on an environment of scarcity.
Uh-huh.
And that then it's been shown by several academics, including Diop, Dixon, who came up with the dialectical theory, a guy called Edwin Nichols, and Wade Nobles. And they all show that this environment of scarcity leads to it's more likely to lead to dichotomous thinking.
Mm.
And it's more likely to lead to patriarchal structures because of this.
Right.
So I think I think we need to look at this. I think we need to firstly apply dialectical thinking, and then we can sort of get over this. But we also have to have a worldview that is from abundance. And in order to do that, we need to start looking beyond Western knowledge structures, beyond Eastern knowledge structures as well, because we're quite familiar with those, and start incorporating African knowledge structures and worldviews. And I think once we do that, we'll have a more complete picture of the world, because I think for me, that's what's missing at the moment.
Right. Yeah. So this thing of abundance, right? Yeah. Because it feels to me like a kind of a tricky one, because in this particular quote, they're talking about increasingly scarce funding, right? So there's this kind of that there's a almost it invokes a kind of, there's a capitalist overlay here, right? There's something about money as a form of resource, as a mode of directing human attention and action. And so it's interesting to hear from you that there's something in African tradition which helps kind of either step around or move us beyond this sort of almost, it's like there's a fear or a scarcity based mindset, isn't there?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about some of that? I mean, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, well, there was actually a paper written on this in the 70s. I've just found the title.
Mm.
There's a paper written in the 70s by Vernon J. Dixon, who's the same guy who came up with diurnal thinking. To put some more context, he was in a conversation with another guy called Edwin Nichols, who was really looking on worldviews and the differences in worldviews that came with the diurnal thinking.
Mm.
Um, and Vernon Dixon's paper was on a black epistemology and sickle cell anemia. Now, sickle cell anemia is it's an adaptation that is found mainly in black populations, where I believe it's the red blood cells are slightly curved,
Yeah.
and this is good because it helps fight against malaria, but it's bad because it means that my red blood cells, I think, I don't think they last as long as they're meant to, and the creation of them is not as fast as they normally. I might be wrong on that. I had a friend back in childhood who's sickle cell anemic. It's really unheard of. It doesn't get enough funding. It's black, you know, and the scholarship around it tends to be from black academics and black thought, because it comes from this abundance mindset, is not seen. It's kind of dehumanized. That's part of the dehumanization of black thought, basically. So Vernon J. Dixon sees all of this. He says, okay, a black epistemology, what is it? And he goes into that. I'm not going to go into it. Well, I'll go into it a little bit here. He says, and this is linked with the stuff he did with Nichols. He says that this the scarcity mindset comes with epistemology that is person to object related, whereas the abundance mindset comes with a person to person relation. So what that means is, what that means in a really practical sense is a person to person will respect the interconnection between people, rather than the scarcity mindset will respect what people can do, what they can get out, you know, what they can what capital they can extract, how they can maximize object, what objects they can give you, what objects they can bring, you know. And this difference means that yeah, when this difference is taken in, we can see then that sickle cell anemia probably isn't going to get the funding it needs, but then it needs to be a different epistemology applied to these practices. So it has to move beyond the traditional reward structures. We have to find again that there is a reward in what has not been rewarded and do it anyway. Um, yeah, this is, yeah, it's kind of lucky because this basically essentially says you're doing the things on an amateur basis. You might be an expert, but you're going to do it on an amateur basis. And this is fortunate because I believe, I can't remember his name exactly, but one of the guys who spoke about hypermodernism said that this is one of the only areas that cannot be commodified, and that is the amateur experience. And so this area then is able to come free of commodification and all of the individualism that brings, and the capitalization that brings. And so, yeah,
Mm.
very difficult to do things without funding. And this is why, um, yeah,
Yeah.
in the olden times, you know, men would, like guys like Newton and all these, they would have someone there doing a lot of labor for them, unpaid, bringing them food while they're spending ages ignoring the family, you know, and concentrating on all their work and stuff. And yeah, we have to find that again. And yeah, and the difficulty is nowadays we're trying to do individually what 20 or 30 people would have been, you know, would have been helping to do in the past. And to build, and that's why Amazon says it's a way to bridge the gap and to initiate these dialogues and keep them going.
So I missed I missed you went blank at one point, and I missed quite a bit of the end. So we got some
we're having a bit of a
unstable connection problem. Are we back? Yeah, cool. Okay.
I think so.
Yeah. So where did you? I'm just trying to remember where you got to before the freeze. So yeah, you were talking about trying to do things without funding, and I think you'd said something about trying to do where 20 people would have been doing something one individual's trying to do more.
It's an arbitrary number, but what I'm basically saying is, okay, so even if in the 1800s, for instance, if I was a young man, even if I wasn't married, I still have my family, my mum, there would be someone to, generally the people who were making these advances in these society, they had a lot of free labor, and we don't have that now. And especially in the amateur space. So this is kind of partly a potential advantage of AI here. But really, it would be better, especially in modern circles, if we could build some sort of interdisciplinary forum where people can come together from different angles and work through, the differences of what we have. So this can then reach out into the academy, as Jason Storm calls it, because if this starts happening in the academies, people will start seeing the links between the different disciplines, and then that will lead to more solutions, interdisciplinary solutions, and then this will lead both the public and the governments and our corporations who are doing a lot of the funding of this stuff to see exactly the value of being interdisciplinary, and so once that happens, then the funding scarcity will change in the sense of at least the different disciplines won't be fighting against each other. But really, it does point to how the amateur realm is the only place where commodification can't really interfere, and so because of that, that's a really good place. So for the really important stuff that needs to be done, like sickle cell anemia, do it anyway. We need to do it regardless of the funding. Find some ways of doing it regardless of the funding.
Because the thing that I'm there are a few things. I mean, the sickle. I mean, with that, the first thing that came up was that, and even using that as an example, the sickle cell issue. That's a prime example of one issue solving for a particular problem, e.g. malaria, but also not solving for other issues, which is, so there's this the sense of the one thing containing a problem and solution within it, and so to simply decide that you want to say end sickle cell and get rid of it, well, that's going to cause a problem, right? You're going to be increasing the risk of malaria, and to allow sickle cell, well, that's also going to cause a problem, right? So there's a need to kind of yes and both of the elements of this particular discussion around sickle cell in order to move and progress. So that's the first thing, is that embedded in that particular thing is a kind of metaphor for the whole thing that we're talking about. And the other thing as well, I also wanted to point to was this abundance mentality can only emerge when people have a genuine felt sense of like okayness, abundance, they need to feel like they've got enough of whatever it is that they need to be able to basically do things in an amateur way for free, right? As gifts, because they're things that need to be done, right? And not waiting for the market to notice that it's a problem, not waiting for other people to notice that it's a problem, but just doing the thing because it's a thing that needs to be done. And as humans, it's our job to do things, hopefully the right things, you know. So now, the problem with the problem that we might walk into with this amateur thing, right, is there's still a question left over, okay, which is, why is any given individual doing this thing for free, right? So money doesn't become the motivator. Something else then becomes the motivator. And the question then is, well, what's that other thing, right? Like solving problems, making the world a better place, reducing suffering, right? You know, all of these things, they're kind of easy to say, right? Like I can say these things and like, yes, we should be aiming to do those things, you know. And another book that both of us are familiar with, by Hansi Freinacht, there's like a list of subjective states, right? You know, with like hell at the bottom and then ecstasis, or I can't remember exactly what it is, something, you know, some other languaging for amazingness at the top. And so being able to categorize the difference between kind of felt states, that's useful. But then we also get into this problem of, well, you know, whatever my amateur project is, I think is important, right? So I'm going to just carry on and crack on and do that. But that then butts up against whatever your amateur project is. And so there's still the potential for antagonism. And the risk of maybe removing the capitalism, right, or the monetary motivator, is that the motivator then is up for grabs as a thing to consider and think about. I think probably on the whole, over time, most people want the world to be a better place, even if it's just for themselves, right? So things should improve, right? But I don't know whether that's wishful thinking or not. Maybe this is my non-abundant preconditioning, you know, my skepticism or whatever coming in and ruining things. But what do you think about that? Like the issue with amateur motivators is that, well, ideologies could be a motivating factor, religions, with all of the problems that emerge as a result of some of those sorts of motivators.
So, so I'm going to try and start at the top and come back.
Yeah.
So the problem. So first, I want to start with the problem of scarcity and abundance, because you're right. Like, you know, it can't be hidden that there is a definite scarcity of funds, not least because of how much funds is circulating and offshore accounting, and so wages are stagnating. You know, not least because of that, but there is a finite amount of things on Earth. You know, so that is true. And yet there is also an abundance at the same time. And this is where the different epistemologies come in. So yes, there is the person to object. There is definitely a scarcity of person to object. That's valid. That's a valid observation. And you could see people as objects, and there are a scarcity of people. You know, some people say the world's overpopulated. I don't subscribe to that view, but because for me, I would like to meet more like-minded people. So in that sense, there is a scarcity, you know. But at the
Mm.
same time, when you hone right down to beyond just the epistemology of the difference in worldviews, and you go to like ontological or cosmological, then we can see that there's a difference in the understanding of spirit, for example. So there's an abundance of spirit, there's an abundance of emotion, there's abundance, even if there's a scarcity of interpersonal connections, there is the potential within those interpersonal connections for infinite amounts of, well, it might as well be near to infinite amounts of emotion, because how do we quantify emotion? How do we quantify qualities? So in this sense, and then there's also the sense of the infinite amount of space, because I'm just going to now point us into our minds and say, is the spatial aspect of our minds that we can travel in our imagination, is that limited by finite things? And for me, it isn't. For me, that's an infinite space where I could keep traveling there all day, and I wouldn't get to the end of it, because it's a conception that I make in my head. So in that sense, there is an abundance of potentialities within the human spirit, and the potentialities of our emotional connection with each other and with the outside world. And so that is for me, that would be a great place to start in terms of seeing things abundantly. This would then, as you said, rightly said, we will, if we're not motivated by money, we would at first be motivated by our worldviews, and so this might cause antagonisms. For example, if someone's making an amateur project here and I'm making an amateur project there, and they clash in some way, then that would make an antagonism. So I'm going to suggest that the antagonism is exacerbated to almost unbearable levels when the amateur project is seen as a source of primary disposable income. So if I'm selling a book about a certain subject and someone else comes on and they are an amateur, I'm saying that I'm an amateur and I'm selling a book, and someone else comes along and they're an amateur, and it seems they're coming up with this stuff and that could be put into a book, I'm going to be like, no, because you're going to affect my sales. If both of these are truly amateur projects, and it's not about making the money from those things, then what happens is those of them will say, okay, well, what's about yours is different from mine, and let's have a dialogue about this, and let's see and try and see if there's actually, this especially happens if we are putting the person before the objects. The objects is the text, the work, and the money that comes from it. When we put the person before, it's like, okay, so what actually is the difference between our worldviews, which leads us to have the differences in these understandings, or what is the difference in our perspectives? They're kind of similar, but they're slightly different, My perspective is where I am. My perspective is my temporal, spatial point in time, and all the stuff I have, that's my perspective. Well, not all the stuff I have. I would say the stuff I have is the lens in between me and my perspective. You see what I'm saying? So the worldview is the lens. The perspective is my ends, as we say in Britain. It's where I am right now. It's where I'm based. It's my ends. So we've got my ends, we've got my lens. And for me, if we're doing this like as a person-to-person thing, then the person is really the ends, not the lens, And we both have these lenses in between us, so we want to get to know the person, And so then we see the lens. We want to see what our lenses are, where the conflicts are, why that come about, and this is the key about the Diop's two cradle theory, which I've expanded on. In Diop's two cradle theory, the environment directly leads to the worldview. The environment leads to the worldview via social and family structures. And so
McLuhan's medium and message come to mind here. Yeah. Right. So what you're talking about then is trying to create the conditions in which we can amateur more, and amateur more effectively,
and together.
Yeah. Right. And I suppose all of the stuff around universal basic income, assuming value in the human and providing a UBI for everybody might sort of help this thing along.
And people people always like, where's the money going to come from that for universal basic income? But the funny thing is that if you actually gave everyone a universal basic income, because of the way that money is created in our society, it would actually be beneficial to the economy to do that. Borrowing the money to give people would be more beneficial because of the way that money is created.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, the story of the US dollar is crazy here. And when I say the story of the US dollar, I mean literally the story as I understand it of the US dollar. Is what I'm about to do is probably butcher the story of the US dollar, but from what I can gather, the greenback was created as debt from the get-go. So with the assumption that when America, the United States of America, gained its independence, that there would be some future state in which you could spend this money. So even if that isn't true, right? Even if that isn't true, that assumption that we're going to build something that has value, and we may as well start trading bits of that value now. You know, the value will come later, right? That's this notion of debt of like the value is going to come later. We'll just may as well start trading it now. And it links to that kind of the fiat currency system and all of the debates around that, about whether we should be able to just make money essentially from nothing. But it's not from nothing. It's about, I think it's about a belief in human potential. But
that's a nice bit.
The thing with that though is that there can be these inflationary pressures, right? Which is right now we're feeling it, certainly here in the UK, and I think it's everywhere. Which is, you know, this money has just been created, sent out into the economy, but it has knock-on effects. And this, I think, this thing about economy being it's partially strapped to human imagination, and it's partially strapped to reality. And the other thing I was going to say though is that I kind of see what you're saying around the potentials of human imagination, and the potentials of the inner world and interactions between people, and maybe culture and forms of culture, and all of which seem to be very human things. But it is nonetheless strapped to this physical reality, right? There's, you know, we only get the energy to do all of this thinking because the sun is providing it, and has done. You know, every time we're extracting fossil fuels, right? We're using kind of billions of or millions of years worth of sunlight but we're using it now, and we're using it all up. So this thing about economy, I think is really important to the whole project. And I don't think and this is me coming in probably, I don't think by removing, say, capitalism or removing notions of finance solves the problem, because there's always something that we're reaching and striving for, and quite often it's different to what it comes into contact with what other people are striving for. But yeah, it's like there needs to be a lightness of touch around it all, doesn't there? We could do to be able to just sit in a space and say what we think without being so tightly bound to it that we can't cope with it being challenged, or that we can't cope with that we have to kind of lurch into violence. It needs to become kinetic in order to, yeah. And so that's it's a deep humility, really, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the academy could do with a lot more humility.
Yeah.
And I think the liminal web could do with it as well.
Yeah.
If I'm blunt, you know, like
Yeah.
there's a lot of dick swinging,
Yeah.
you know, and it comes up in all sorts of kind of strange places, right? And because this is the other thing is with stuff like passive aggression and like that, like the tension that comes from disagreement when it isn't worked through properly, owned up to, known and sat with, can kind of be dissipated and then pops up in kind of really odd places and in certain ways, and you know, so I think that this is as I think we've mentioned before, even if not on record, the this is the task, I think. How do we collectively sit together and work on stuff
Yeah.
without holding too tightly onto whatever our thing is, you know?
Yeah.
Um
And it's funny because that's what Nigerian-born metamodernist, he coined the term independently, Moyo Okadeji.
yeah.
I'm going to read a quote because he
Mm.
thinks that metamodernism is like that as well. He says, thinking of metamodernism as becoming some kind of bridge discourse that is capable of finding ways to initiate some kind of reconciliation without necessarily being able to solve problems. Problems will always be there, but we need to talk about them in a way that enables us to continue a dialogue, because it is when people stop a dialogue, the war begins. When they can no longer find words, then they close down everything and start fighting. And I mean, I think true words can't be spoken uh, really in terms of that. And
Mm.
what it speaks to is that when you take friction, when you accept friction, then you can get traction. But if you just like try and ignore friction, then you can't get traction. And but what it also requires is degrees of freedom. So linear dichotomous thinking from a scarcity mindset, um, that will reduce the degrees of freedom that any conflict has. So the friction has nowhere to go and just creates heat and light and seems to make a mess. And like, what can you do with it? You know.
Mm.
But actually, that heat and light is energy. And actually, if there were more degrees of freedom using non-linear, diunital, abundance worldview thinking, then that opens up degrees of freedom. The problem is when we have one or the other. So if I've just got a scarcity mindset, that's like a game, what Hans calls game acceptance. You know, just accept things as they are. When I've got abundance mindset, then that's what, and just an abundance mindset, then that's what he calls game denial, and saying, okay, no, things aren't like that, you know. They're actually like this, they're actually really abundant, you know. But actually, game change comes when we bring both of those together. And because it's both of those, this signifies that why we're really stuck and why we've become stuck and we're in this loop and we're oscillating in this hypermodern mode. And it's because without this abundant African sense of both and, we just have the dichotomy. With, you know, and so we need to bring those together. And at the moment, when they're brought together, the dominant is always the scarcity mindset, which goes back to antiquity in terms of nomadic and sedentary cultures. Yeah, so I think that's it. I just want to pick up on something you said about the economics as well. Thank you for that. I'm going to look into that. Regardless if it's not true or not, I'm going to thank you for that. I'm going to look into it because it sounds like it possibly could be true. Because as we all know, Americans were the first Americans were British, you know, and the crown had a lot of sway over those territories, as well as other European states. But one particular thing about Britain, and I like that we are two British people interested in modernism talking about economics, because it doesn't really get talked about. And for
Mm.
me, that whole thing started here in Britain in 1067 when William the Conqueror came over, and the only place that you couldn't conquer was not London itself. I don't think it was a thing at the time, but the city of London, which is a for those of you who don't know the city of London, I mean, I might get in trouble for talking about this, but the city of London is it's a city within a city. So it's a city within the city of London, which is a financial district, and it's also a state within a state, and that is a state within England. If you don't believe me, look it up. That's for the people who are going to watch. But yeah, I know you probably know about that. And because of that, so where's the money for the expansion into the new world going to come from? It's going to come from the banks and the speculations, as you suggested, in the potential of humanity, and also the objective resources which are going to be in this new world. And so for you to say that the dollar was first based on debt, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's totally. I mean, a lot of fine. I mean, it's to me when I look at economics, it's magic. It's total magic. It's symbolism. It's, you know, and there's just a sort of shared trust that this thing that doesn't exist, but there's like a shared trust that somehow I'll be able to spend it in the future, you know. So I'm going to give up time, effort, energy in exchange for this thing, and it's just pure belief, you know. And like magic, it has its own sort of kind of, I don't know, I want to say priest class, but like shamanic class or something, you know, that's like the druids or whatever, that are like, they know what they're doing, right? And us, we don't know what we're doing. we don't know what's going on. So we sort of chase this magic around, you know. So yeah, and it's again, and we talked a little earlier on the recording, but actually weeks ago we talked about alchemy and that thing about taking lead and turning it into gold. And there's something about that in economics, which is I think it can be really useful and productive and creative and energizing, but it can also be, you know, you're playing with, you can play with dark magic, you know, like, so it can be sort of, it can be dangerous too. I have one more image, which I don't think is really of any use. I think we've covered everything. There's one phrase I want to say from it. I keep looking over here for that, but and
let's see it.
Okay, you want to see it? Okay, cool.
Yeah. I'm sure it's going to have use. Come on, it's not going to be useless. Come on. I also want to see what you've done as well. At least one of us is doing kind of doing this.
Okay. So there's just a thing here about the shared terrain between the modernists and the postmodernists. That's my little riff on a kind of cross between a landscape and a Venn diagram or something. I don't know what that is, but it's, you know, in the valley between the two, that's the bit where we sort of maybe want to be residing with our fractals mentioned before. And then land grabbing in the academy. So I think out here I was wanting just to raise, I had my own little article, like set of articles fairly recently around land grabbing and trying to look at that, right? And this thing about space and ownership, and looking at that metaphorically, maybe around you know, this battle around language and what the right words are to use to describe a specific thing, and whether it's come up from your particular tradition or whether it's come up from some other particular, you know, tradition in the academy, whether you're a scientist or a, you know, whatever, sociologist, or you know, a religious studies professor, or a, you know, music major, like whatever your particular background is, and the way of looking at and understanding reality. There's an inherent form of land grabbing built in that. Yeah, so I just kind of wanted to raise that, largely because it's kind of where my eyeballs are at the minute. All around this thing of about value, what the hell it is, where it comes from. Yeah. So that's that. Any more thoughts before we end up, and then I can get this edited and.
The only thought I had about the kind of intersection space that you had with modernism, postmodernism, there's been a play written. Forgive me if I get his name wrong. Ashkat Kair, but it's called "The Truth Be Told: A Tragedy in the Making." I actually had an idea for it. I was going to call it Five Modes Named Mo or something like that. Because there's a play called Five Guys Named Mo, and
all right,
but the characters are things like metamodernism, postmodernism, ultramodernism, postcolonialism, and yeah,
that's cool.
I'm
That's really
about
cool.
halfway through, but just on that and but yeah, I know that you won't really talk about that, but when I saw that, I saw like a stage, and I don't know why, but yeah, I guess you were pointing to the fact that Jason Storm in the book just basically, I mean, in the introduction, he lays out what he's going to do, and in the book, he lays out the whole way that modernism and postmodernism are yeah, basically the same thing, which actually in this play is, yeah, there's a bit of hauntology in there, which I'm not going to say anything more of, but yeah.
Yeah. Do you think you could? Because I was trying to make notes on that as you were speaking. Do you think you could maybe, if and when, I'm hoping to try and get it done today, but if and when we get this up and posted on the Facebook page, could you, as a comment, maybe just link to that? Because that sounds really cool.
Yeah, it is, and it's short as well. It's short and it's fun, and yeah, and it's on Kindle. But
right, yeah, great, okay, nice. Well, good. First one we've done, I think, on the first one, which was the opening. We've had a little bit of interest on possibly doing chapter one with some other people. So I'll get in touch with those people. And in fact, what I might do is link them to this discussion so that they can get a sense of where we're at before leaping into the next chapter. Nice one.
Cool. Nice one, man.
Yeah. See you later.
See you.